We're joined now by our Senior Counsel for Global Affairs, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Secretary Pompeo, we've got a new report out now that the French intelligence officials had warned the Obama State Department back in 2015 that China was reducing cooperation with the French and that they had collaborated in this new construction in the Wuhan lab, and that the French were eventually kicked out a couple years later. They weren't allowed to participate at all in the lab's research. And again, we're seeing like daily evidence pointing back to problems from the Wuhan lab. I mean, more and more every single day while the world is still dealing with this problem. So what are just your thoughts on this new report that the French intelligence was warning the U.S. government 6 years ago about this lab?
So, Jordan, it was very clear to us early on when the virus became transmissible, lethal, and had escaped into the world that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was at the base of it all. And while we couldn't prove it because, as you described, doctors being disappeared, journalists being taken off the map, we knew this history. We knew the history of the French-built lab. We knew the history that they'd been kicked out. We knew that there had been resources placed there in an attempt to try and make the lab more secure. But we knew that those had all ended in a bad way. And we had a laboratory that was unsafe and practicing unsafe gain-of-function research. We now are in a place where we can say with absolute certainty that the Chinese Communist Party foisted this virus upon the world. And it is now the time for the world, not just the United States, but the entire world, to rise up and force the Chinese to account for the billions of dollars that they've destroyed and all of the millions of lives that have been lost.
Yeah. With all of that, we still have officials, though, Secretary Pompeo, that are like Dr. Fauci, that defend this lab, even with this information that, and knowing, I'm assuming, with his work, that would have known these concerns from, others in his field. But it's like he's running interference. I feel like we see this a lot with anything that involves China, is that these officials, whether they are doing it because they actually believe it or not, are willing to go to bat for the Chinese.
Jordan, I've said this before. Dr. Fauci mouthed the exact same words of the Chinese Communist Party. He told the world, he said, why would they cover this up? They would want the world to know. Well, we know why they're covering up. They don't want us to know that these butchers, these people who have no desire to protect and preserve human life and will do anything to make their country the global hegemon, saw this and allowed people to travel to Milan, Italy, to travel across the world. They closed on their own borders. I can only say this. I can't account for why Dr. Fauci is touting the same line that the Chinese Communist Party is, but it is so disconnected from reality and so dangerous. The risk of something like this happening again from that same laboratory is so serious that Dr. Fauci should not be involved in the United States government. This is really a risky proposition for America to have Dr. Fauci, who believes that this laboratory should actually be conducting viral research that can do precisely what we've seen happen over the last 17 months.
Yeah, I mean, when you try to get people, to go along with the recommendations of the scientists and the CDC or the person who could replace Dr. Fauci, and he's become so controversial because of these statements, because of the back and forths he's gotten into with members of Congress as well on this and the continued defense. But I want to contrast it, too, with the new piece you've got up at ACLJ.org. We talked about it a little bit yesterday with you, but on cybersecurity and the response to the cyber attacks on the U.S. You gave some credit in there to the Biden administration for calling out China's Ministry of State Security for their role in a cyber attack on Microsoft. But you point to the fact that we're calling out. We see tough talk, but not action. If there's no action, I mean, you've been dealing with the Chinese directly as Secretary of State, as CIA director, as a member of Congress. If there's no actual consequences, and it's just the U.S. government condemning with words, do the Chinese back down at all? This idea, though, that you give credit to the Biden administration for calling out the Chinese doesn't seem to be like that's the problem. It's not the words, it's the actions. It's that we're not doing anything that really is a punishment.
No, Jordan, there have to be real costs imposed. It's not about mouthing the right words. They're going to finish this so-called investigation in 30 days or so. No matter what it says, we know enough already. We can seize assets. We can file lawsuits. There are a myriad of tools. We can sanction senior leaders. We can build out a coalition around the world who says we're not going to conduct operations in and around Wuhan, the place from which this virus came. The tools are readily available. We don't need any new laws. We don't need anything other than an administration that is prepared to impose enormous cost on China, the same way they imposed enormous costs on the United States of America.
Does the same go to? I mean, we know we're about a month away from an intel report that President Biden asked on the COVID origins. Again, the tough talk, but no action. A report, let's say this report does shed new light, that the administration's talking points change and they kind of come to the realization that everyone has come to, that this is more likely than not something that happened in the lab and that it leaked, and we're really looking at intent, whether it was intentional or just horrendously negligent, to the point of where in most, any places would be criminally negligent considering what's going on still in the world today with this virus. But even if they do all that, is the same as the cybersecurity? I could expect tough words, but then what is going to be the follow up from, as you said, not just the United States but the world? If the world actually came together, we could punish China, right? They are big, they're powerful, but they can't escape the justice from the world if the world was willing to do it.
No, Jordan, they certainly couldn't. One of the tasks that we began was to convince the world of what had taken place here. And I want to step back just for a second. We focus on this lab. That's important. There's lots of reasons for that. But we know this, whether it was from the lab or as Dr. Fauci says, some natural, I don't believe that for a second, but if it were, it is still the case that the cover-up, the crime, the transmission, the movement of this very contagious, highly lethal virus around the world is something that the Chinese Communist Party knowingly engaged in. So whatever this report says, whatever the administration comes up with, we know this. There's enough evidence that says that the Chinese Communist Party foisted a virus upon the world, and they've killed millions of people. If they did that with any other mechanism, Jordan, they did that with missiles, if they did that in any other way, the world would demand that we hold them accountable and impose enormous costs on them. We have to do that. It is imperative. If we don't do this, the Chinese Communist Party will see the world for what we are. They'll see us as weak, and we can't permit this to happen. They will drive a truck through that weakness.
Final question, Secretary Pompeo. We're still dealing with this in our country. I mean, we saw the CDC, the new recommended guidelines. It kind of depends on where you live in the country, how that's affecting you. Some places it's affecting people more than others. But we don't know what that will necessarily be like in the fall. But we know that the virus is real, and it's still, I mean, if we look around the world, it is crippling the world from reopening. We're not there yet. I mean, and this idea that if we have to go through, which it looks like we will, at least another year to get back to normal at a global stage, not just at home, not just in our local community, but at a global stage, that's not going to happen necessarily it doesn't feel like it's going to be happening this fall when you look at what's happening in the world. Do you think that could be the tipping point for some of these world leaders and maybe the current U.S. government as well, an administration, to say, you know what, enough is enough with dealing with the Communist Party of China, and that we've got to impose these punishments? I mean, how long is the world going to take this severe pandemic?
I pray that that's the case. I will say that the evidence to date, right, we're now 18 months in. Countries like India, countries like Japan, they've been greatly impacted by this. I hope that they will see that the United States will have their back. And that's what it's going to take American leadership here, Jordan. None of these countries will impose costs on China if we're not alongside them in leading this effort. But if we get this right, if America is prepared to take actions, not just issue press releases, not just have meetings and scold them, but actually impose real costs on them. If the United States is prepared to do that, these other countries, whether they're in Southeast Asia, whether they're in Africa, whether they're in Eastern Europe, who've truly been impacted by what the Chinese Communist Party did to the world, I think we can build out a coalition and convince the Chinese Communist Party that it's going to be painful and they can never permit something like this to happen again. We should start, just Jordan, with a really easy one. We should kick them out of the World Health Organization. We left, the United States left in the Trump administration because this had become a political organization. The right answer is for Dr. Tedros to kick them out of the organization because they have undermined any credibility that organization might ever have had.
I mean, they won't even as they announced last week, they're not even going to let the World Health Organization back. And there's problems there, as you just talked about, Secretary Pompeo. But there you go, folks. Solutions. actual solutions to these issues, how to move forward if you have the guts to do so and the will to do so, and to convince the world and our allies.